We already sold the company. My son said it like he was announcing dessert. He didn't look at me when he said it. He was cutting his steak, medium rare, just the way his father used to like it. The dining room was warm, the chandelier casting a soft yellow glow over the same oak table my husband and I bought 42 years ago, back when the company was nothing more than a rented garage and a second-hand truck. Across from me, my daughter-in-law smiled politely. Not surprised, not confused, just prepared. I folded my napkin slowly and placed it beside my plate. I'm sorry, I said. You did what? My son finally looked up. He gave me that calm, reassuring smile he used to wear when he was 10 and had broken a window with a baseball. We finalized the deal last week, Mom. It's done. It was the right time. The right time. The portrait of my husband hung on the wall behind him. In the photo, Richard was standing in front of our first warehouse, 5,000 square feet of concrete floors and stubborn hope. We built that company together. I handled payroll at the kitchen counter while raising a toddler. I met with suppliers with a baby monitor in my purse. I signed loan papers when the bank didn't believe in us. And now it was done. You sold all of it. I asked quietly. Most of it, my son replied. We retained a small advisory stake. But the controlling interest is gone. Gone. My daughter-in-law reached for her wine glass. It's a new chapter, she said smoothly. Less stress for everyone. Especially you. Especially me. I nodded once. I reached for my water glass because my hands needed something to hold. The ice had melted. I hadn't noticed. When were you going to tell me? I asked. My son hesitated for half a second. We wanted everything finalized first. We didn't want you to worry. Worry. For 18 months after Richard's funeral, I had shown up to every board meeting. I had signed every quarterly report placed in front of me. I had listened while my son talked about expansion, acquisitions, restructuring. I stepped back when he asked me to. I told myself it was his time. But I never stepped away. I see, I said. No one else spoke. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. Somewhere outside, a car drove past slowly. My son leaned back in his chair. You don't have to deal with any of it anymore. We took care of everything. I looked at him carefully. At the confidence in his posture. At the way my daughter-in-law avoided my eyes. I didn't sign anything, I said. He smiled again. You didn't need to. He smiled. You didn't need to. The words settled between us like dust. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. Maybe he meant I had signed something earlier. Maybe there had been a document buried in the stack of quarterly reports he used to leave on my desk. But I knew my own signature. And I knew when I hadn't given it. I looked down at my plate. My steak had gone cold. I hadn't taken a single bite. What do you mean I didn't need to? I asked. My son wiped his mouth with his napkin. Calm. Patient. As if explaining something simple to someone older than him. Which I was. The restructuring last year, Mom. When Dad's shares were transferred into the family trust. The voting authority shifted. It streamlined things. Streamlined. I remembered that meeting. It had been 3 months after Richard's funeral. I was still wearing black most days. The lawyer had come to the house. Papers were stacked neatly on the coffee table. My son had sat beside me, one hand on my shoulder. This just protects everything, he had said back then. In case something happens. Something had already happened. I signed because I trusted him. Now he was telling me that signature had erased my voice. So you had authority? I said slowly. He nodded. Operational authority. Yes. And selling the company is operational. My daughter-in-law jumped in gently. It was a strategic decision. The market was peaking. It would have been irresponsible not to consider it. Irresponsible. For 42 years, I had never missed a payroll. Not during the recession. Not when our biggest client went bankrupt. Not when Richard had heart surgery and I ran everything from a hospital chair. Irresponsible was not a word anyone had ever used about me. I folded my hands in my lap to keep them steady. How much? I asked. My son hesitated this time. 8 figures, he said finally. It's life-changing money, Mom. Life-changing. I studied his face. He was excited. Proud, even. As if he had closed the biggest deal of his career. Maybe he had. And where? I asked quietly. Is my portion? The room shifted. My daughter-in-law set her glass down carefully. Of course you'll be taken care of, she said. That was always part of the plan. Taken care of. I wasn't asking to be taken care of. I was asking what they thought I owned. I pushed my chair back slowly and stood up. I'm tired, I said. We'll talk tomorrow. My son looked relieved. Of course. Get some rest. I walked past the portrait of my husband on the wall. I paused for just a second. They thought it was finished. They thought it was done. But I had learned something important at that table. They hadn't asked for my signature, because they believed they no longer needed it. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was shocked, but because I was remembering. At 6:30 the next morning, I was already in my kitchen. The same kitchen where I used to review payroll reports with a cup of black coffee and a legal pad. The house was quiet. My son and his wife had moved into the guest wing temporarily, while renovations were happening at their new place. Renovations. I opened the drawer beside the refrigerator and took out the old leather folder Richard and I had used for important documents. It still smelled faintly like paper and ink. Inside were copies, share certificates, trust amendments, board resolutions. I may have signed papers after the funeral, but I never stopped keeping records. By 8 a.m., I was dressed and in my car. I didn't call my son. I didn't text. I drove 25 minutes downtown to the bank where our corporate accounts had been held for decades. The receptionist recognized me immediately. "Mrs. Carter," she said warmly. "We haven't seen you in a while." "I've been busy," I replied. That was true. I requested copies of the most recent transaction summaries tied to the holding company. Large transfers, escrow movements, acquisition deposits. The banker hesitated for a moment. "There was a significant transfer last week," he said carefully, "related to a liquidity event." Liquidity event. That's what they were calling it. "I'd like the documentation," I said. He printed the summaries. I watched the numbers line up across the page. 8 figures. My son hadn't exaggerated. The funds had moved into a newly structured entity, one I didn't recognize. That was the first red flag. When Richard and I built the company, we kept ownership simple, clear, transparent. The operating company fed into the holding trust. The trust protected the family. Now there was a new LLC listed as majority recipient. I had never seen that name before. I drove from the bank to the small law office 3 blocks away. Not the firm my son preferred. Not the young attorney who handled modern restructuring. I went to Daniel Harper. He had drafted our original shareholder agreements 35 years ago. He had sat at our kitchen table more times than I could count. He looked older now. So did I. "Margaret," he said softly when I stepped inside. "I'm sorry it's under these circumstances." "You don't know the circumstances yet," I replied. I placed the bank documents on his desk. "My son says he sold the company," I said, "and that I didn't need to sign." Daniel adjusted his glasses. He began reading. He didn't speak for a full minute. Then he looked up at me. "Did you authorize a transfer of your Class A shares?" "No," he leaned back slowly. "Then they may have sold something," he said carefully. "But not everything." For the first time since dinner, I felt something settle inside me. Not anger. Clarity. They believed I had stepped aside. They believed grief had made me passive. They forgot something simple. I was there at the beginning. And I was still here now. That evening, I didn't confront him again. I cooked dinner. Roasted chicken. Mashed potatoes. Green beans with butter and almonds. The same meal I used to make on Sundays when the company was still small and every dollar mattered. Back then, Richard would come home tired but satisfied. He would loosen his tie, sit at this same table, and ask me about invoices and supplier calls as if they were as important as contracts. Because to him, they were. My son came downstairs just before 7. He looked at his phone twice before sitting down. "Smells good," he said. "Thank you," I replied. We ate quietly for a few minutes. Then he cleared his throat. "I didn't mean for this to feel secretive," he said. Timing was critical. The buyer wanted discretion. Discretion. Discretion from the market, I asked. From everyone. I nodded slowly. "When your father and I signed our first expansion loan," I said, "the bank asked us 3 times if we understood the risk. We signed anyway. Together." He didn't respond. "The night before we opened the second warehouse," I continued, "we sat on the concrete floor and ate takeout because we couldn't afford chairs yet. We decided every major move would require both of us in the room." "That was different," he said quietly. "You were building. And you think I stopped?" I asked. He looked at me then. Really looked. "You said you wanted me to lead," he replied. "I said I trusted you to grow it," I corrected gently. "Not to remove me." Silence again. Upstairs, I heard my daughter-in-law moving around. A drawer opening. Closing. "Mom," he said carefully. "The trust documents shifted voting authority last year. Legally, I had the power." Legally. I know what the amendment says, I replied. His eyebrows lifted slightly. He hadn't expected that. But legal authority and ethical responsibility aren't always the same thing, I added. He leaned back in his chair. You're making this bigger than it is. No, I said calmly. You made it bigger when you sold something your father and I spent 4 decades building. He pressed his lips together. You'll be financially secure for the rest of your life, he said. Isn't that what matters? Financially secure. I set my fork down. When I was your age, I said quietly, security meant knowing we kept our word. He didn't answer that. After dinner, he helped clear the table. A small habit he'd kept since childhood. Plates stacked carefully. Silverware aligned. For a moment, I saw the boy who used to run through the warehouse with a clipboard twice his size, pretending to be CEO. Then the moment passed. As he carried the dishes to the sink, I spoke without raising my voice. Tomorrow, I said, I want a full copy of the sale agreement. Every page. He paused. That's not necessary. It is, I said simply. He turned slowly. And if I say no? I met his eyes. Then we find out who actually has the final authority. The air between us shifted. Because for the first time since that dinner announcement, he realized something. I wasn't reacting. I was preparing. The next morning, the sale agreement was not on my desk. Instead, there was an email. Subject line, summary of transaction. A summary. 3 pages. Bullet points. Broad language. Asset purchase. Equity rollover. Strategic liquidity. No full contract. No signatures attached. I read it twice. Then I closed it. At 10:15 a.m., Daniel called. I've reviewed the trust amendment again, he said. Your son does have expanded operational control. I know, I replied. But, he continued carefully, there's a distinction between management authority and disposition of core assets tied to Class A oversight. Disposition of core assets. Meaning? I asked. Meaning if the sale transferred controlling equity in a way that affects the underlying trust structure, your consent may still be required. May. Not definite. But not impossible. Do you have the full purchase agreement? He asked. Not yet. I'll request it formally, he said. By noon, my son was pacing in the living room. Why is Daniel contacting their counsel? He demanded. This makes us look unstable. Unstable. I repeated calmly. To the buyers, he clarified. It creates doubt. I watched him carefully. Doubt about what? I asked. He didn't answer immediately. That silence mattered. My daughter-in-law stepped in smoothly. The deal closed cleanly, she said. Funds cleared. Board approval was documented. Board approval, I said. Without a meeting I attended. You delegated, she replied. Delegated. I stood up and walked to the bookshelf where Richard kept original corporate binders. I pulled one down slowly. You know, I said, flipping through tabs. Your father believed documentation mattered more than intention. I found the page I was looking for. Class A shareholder rights. Veto power over liquidation or sale of controlling interest. I handed the binder to my son. He didn't take it. That clause was addressed in the amendment, he said quickly. Show me where, I replied. He hesitated. Just long enough. The front doorbell rang. All 3 of us turned. A courier stood outside with a certified envelope. My son stiffened. I signed for it. It was a formal acknowledgement from the buyer's legal team confirming receipt of Daniel's inquiry regarding shareholder consent. Inquiry. Not accusation. Not lawsuit. Just a question. But questions can slow momentum. My son ran a hand through his hair. Mom, what are you doing? I'm asking for clarity, I said. You're jeopardizing an 8-figure deal. I met his eyes steadily. If a deal can be jeopardized by one shareholder asking for the contract, I said quietly, then perhaps it wasn't as solid as you thought. The room fell silent again. Outside, a delivery truck drove past. Inside, something else was shifting. For the first time since he smiled across that dinner table, my son wasn't confident. He was calculating. And I realized something important. They had moved fast. Very fast. And sometimes, when people rush a transaction, they leave fingerprints behind. That afternoon, the house was too quiet. Not peaceful. Tense. My son had retreated to his office upstairs. I could hear the faint rhythm of his footsteps pacing across hardwood floors. A phone call. Then another. His voice low. Controlled. By 4 o'clock, Daniel called again. They responded, he said. And? I asked. They're surprised. I almost smiled. Surprised that I'm alive? I replied, surprised that Class A consent wasn't explicitly documented. They assumed it was internally cleared. Assumed. In business, assumptions are expensive. Did they provide the full agreement? I asked. Yes. It was sent over an hour ago. I hadn't seen it, which meant my son had. I'll review it tonight, Daniel continued. But at first glance, the equity transfer appears structured through a holding vehicle your son controls. The new LLC. So technically, I said carefully, he sold operating control. Yes. But not the underlying voting block tied to my original shares. Silence on the line. Margaret, Daniel said slowly. Unless you signed a secondary assignment we haven't located, your shares were never transferred. I sat down at my desk. The weight of 42 years of work felt suddenly very steady. They sold the engine, I said quietly. But I still own the keys. That's one way to put it, Daniel replied. After we hung up, I opened my laptop again. A new email had arrived from my son. Attachment included. Full purchase agreement, confidential. He hadn't wanted me to see it. Now he had no choice. I printed it. All 87 pages. The numbers were large. The language was polished. There were signatures from buyers, from board members, from my son as CEO. But nowhere on the execution pages was my name. I flipped back to the section titled Representations and Warranties. The company warranted full authority to sell controlling interest. Full authority. I stood and walked upstairs. My son was at his desk when I knocked once and entered. He looked tired now. You got the contract, he said. I did. He leaned back. Then you see everything was handled properly. I see. I replied calmly. That you represented full shareholder approval. It was implied under the trust structure. Implied, I repeated. His jaw tightened. You're overcomplicating this. No, I said evenly. I'm separating operational control from ownership. He didn't respond. So I continued. You sold decision-making power, but you did not transfer my Class A block. He stared at me. You can't undo the closing, he said. I don't need to, I answered. The room felt smaller now. If the buyer believes they purchased uncontested control, I continued quietly, and that representation isn't accurate, the risk isn't mine. For the first time since that dinner announcement, he looked uncertain. Not defensive, uncertain, because he understood what I understood. The deal wasn't as clean as he thought, and momentum in business is fragile. Once doubt enters the room, it doesn't leave quietly. I closed the contract binder and placed it gently on his desk. You moved quickly, I said. But you forgot one thing. He didn't ask what. Because he already knew. I had never stopped being an owner. The following morning, the buyer's legal team requested a call. Not with my son. With both of us. That detail mattered. We scheduled it for 11 a.m. sharp. Daniel joined from his office downtown. I sat at the dining table with the contract neatly stacked in front of me. My son took the chair across from me, laptop open, jaw tight. When the call began, the buyer's lead counsel spoke first. We've received an inquiry regarding Class A shareholder consent, he said professionally. We'd like clarification to ensure the integrity of the transaction. Integrity. My son cleared his throat. All operational authority was properly transferred under the amended trust structure. Yes, the attorney replied. We see that. However, the original shareholder agreement appears to grant veto rights over the transfer of controlling interest tied to certain equity blocks. Certain equity blocks. I folded my hands calmly. My shares were never assigned, I said, and I did not execute a consent for this sale. There was a pause on the line. Paper shuffling. Keyboard typing. The attorney spoke again, slower this time. Our understanding was that internal approvals were complete. They were, my son said quickly. I didn't raise my voice. Operational approvals, I corrected. Silence. Daniel stepped in. If there is a discrepancy between operational control and ownership control, that presents potential exposure for both parties. Exposure. No one likes that word. The buyer's counsel asked a direct question. Mrs. Carter, are you asserting that the sale of controlling interest required your explicit consent? I'm stating, I replied evenly, that the governing documents say so. Another pause. Then the tone shifted. We will need to review this internally, the attorney said. Until then, we recommend pausing any public announcements related to full control transition. Pausing. Momentum slowing. After the call ended, my son stood up immediately. This is going to create unnecessary doubt, he said. No, I answered calmly. It's creating necessary review. They could walk away. Then perhaps they should understand exactly what they're buying. He ran a hand through his hair again. I noticed the confidence from dinner night was gone. In its place was calculation. You're risking everything, he said quietly. I looked at him steadily. I'm protecting what was never properly transferred. Downstairs, my daughter-in-law was on the phone, her voice sharper than usual. I caught fragments as I walked past. Temporary delay, legal technicality, nothing major, technicality. That's what they hoped it was. By late afternoon, Daniel called once more. They've identified the gap, he said. Their internal compliance team is concerned about representation accuracy. Concerned. What happens next? I asked. They have 3 options, he replied. Renegotiate. Seek your formal consent. Or suspend the deal. Suspend. The word lingered in the air. Upstairs, I heard my son's footsteps again. Faster this time. They had believed the sale was finished. But in business, a transaction isn't complete until every signature holds. And mine never left the page. For the first time since he smiled across that table, the certainty had shifted. Not to me, just away from him. And that was enough to change everything. By the end of the week, the house no longer felt tense. It felt divided. My son spent most of his time on conference calls behind closed doors. His tone had changed. Less confident. More measured. I could hear words drifting down the hallway. Clarification. Supplemental consent. Risk mitigation. Downstairs, my daughter-in-law had stopped talking about renovations. The glossy brochures for their new house were gone from the kitchen counter. Momentum had slowed. And when momentum slows in business, people start asking harder questions. On Friday afternoon, Daniel called with an update. They've paused the final integration, he said. No operational transfer until ownership consent is resolved. Paused. That meant the buyers weren't fully comfortable stepping in. Are they threatening to withdraw? I asked. Not yet, he replied. But they're evaluating exposure if representations were incomplete. Incomplete. That word carries weight in contract law. I thanked him and hung up. An hour later, my son came downstairs. He didn't sit this time. He stood near the fireplace, arms crossed. They're reconsidering valuation, he said. I looked up from my chair. Because of me? I asked. Because of uncertainty, he corrected quickly. Uncertainty has a price. When you sell control, I said calmly, buyers want clarity. They don't want shadows. He exhaled slowly. They're asking what it would take to secure your formal approval. There it was. Not dismissal. Not pressure. A request. What are they offering? I asked. He hesitated. An adjustment, he said. An additional payout for your shares. A clean secondary consent. So now my signature mattered. I folded my hands together. Before we discuss numbers, I said, I want something else. He looked wary. What? A full board meeting, I replied. In person, with documented minutes. I want every representation explained clearly. That's unnecessary, he said. It's standard, I answered. He studied my face. You're enjoying this, he said quietly. I shook my head. No, I'm correcting it. Upstairs, I heard my daughter-in-law's heels on the hardwood floor. She appeared at the doorway. This is turning into a spectacle, she said carefully. It could damage relationships. Which relationships? I asked. She didn't answer. Because everyone in that room understood something simple. If the buyer walked away, it wouldn't be because I asked for transparency. It would be because the foundation wasn't solid. That evening, I sat alone in my study and opened the original shareholder binder again. I ran my fingers over the tab Richard labeled final authority. He had insisted on that phrase. Not majority. Not influence. Final. People think control disappears when you step back. But control doesn't vanish. It waits. And now, the buyers were waiting too. Not for my son. For me. Because without my signature, the deal wasn't complete. And everyone finally understood that. The board meeting was scheduled for Tuesday at 9 a.m. in the main conference room. The same room where Richard and I used to sit at opposite ends of the long walnut table and debate expansion plans over black coffee. I arrived 10 minutes early. Not to make a statement. Just because I've always believed punctuality reveals seriousness. The buyer's representatives were already there. 2 attorneys. 1 senior partner from the acquisition firm. Polite. Professional. Watching everything. My son entered last. He nodded at me, but didn't smile. The meeting began with formalities. Review of the original purchase agreement. Review of the amended trust structure. Review of board approvals already documented. Then Daniel spoke. We are here to clarify whether the transfer of controlling interest required explicit Class A shareholder consent. Clear. Direct. No emotion. One of the buyer's attorneys adjusted his glasses. Our concern, he said carefully, is that the representation of full authority must be accurate for indemnification purposes. Indemnification. That word makes executives uncomfortable. My son leaned forward. Operational authority was granted to me last year, he said. The board approved the sale unanimously. I waited. Then I opened the original shareholder binder and slid it across the table. Please turn to section 4.2, I said calmly. Pages flipped. Silence settled over the room. The clause was short. Transfer of controlling equity tied to Class A shares requires written consent of the Class A holder. No ambiguity. No fine print. The senior partner looked up. Mrs. Carter, he said evenly, did you sign a written consent? No, I replied. My son shifted in his chair. The amendment implied delegation, he said. Implied delegation, Daniel responded, is not the same as executed consent. Silence again. The buyers exchanged a glance. One of them closed his folder slowly. If this consent is required, he said carefully, the transaction as structured may be incomplete. Incomplete. There it was again. My son spoke quickly. We can execute supplemental consent today. There's no opposition here. He looked at me when he said that. No opposition. I met his eyes. I am not opposed to growth, I said calmly. But I do not sign documents I have not reviewed fully, nor do I consent retroactively to representations made without me. The room went still. The senior partner nodded slightly. That is reasonable, he said. Reasonable. That word shifted the balance more than anger ever could. They weren't viewing me as an obstacle. They were viewing me as a controlling stakeholder. After an hour of discussion, the conclusion was simple. The deal could proceed, but only after a revised valuation reflecting clarified ownership structure, a formal consent agreement drafted with explicit acknowledgement of prior omission, updated indemnification language. In other words, the terms were changing. When the meeting ended, the buyers shook my hand first. Not out of courtesy, out of recognition. As we walked out of the conference room, my son finally spoke. You could have just signed, he said quietly. I stopped. I could have, I agreed. But then you would have believed I no longer mattered. He didn't answer, because for the first time since he smiled across that dinner table, he understood. I wasn't trying to undo the deal. I was redefining it. The revised term sheet arrived 2 days later. Thicker, longer, more careful. The valuation had shifted upward, not dramatically, but enough to acknowledge that the ownership structure was not as simple as my son had first presented. Recognition has a number attached to it in business. This one did too. We gathered again in the conference room that Friday morning. Fewer smiles this time. More documentation. The senior partner spoke plainly. In light of the clarified Class A position, we've adjusted the purchase price to reflect full equity acquisition. Full equity. Not partial control. Not assumed authority. Full. My son kept his posture straight, but I could see the calculation behind his eyes. The deal was still alive, just reshaped. Daniel slid the new consent agreement toward me. This document, he said quietly, explicitly acknowledges that prior representations were made without your executed approval and are now subject to your review. Acknowledges. That word mattered more than the money. I read every page. Slowly, not to intimidate anyone. Just because that's how Richard and I always did it. Clause by clause. Line by line. No assumptions. No shortcuts. The room waited. When I reached the final page, I paused. The signature line carried my name alone. Not founder's widow. Not beneficiary. Margaret Carter. Class A shareholder. I picked up the pen. But before I signed, I looked at my son. Do you understand? I asked calmly. Why this mattered? He hesitated. Then nodded once. Yes. Not defensive, not frustrated, just quieter than before. I signed. The pen moved steadily across the page. No shaking, no hesitation. Afterward, the buyers signed their amended documents. Hands were shaken. Folders were closed. The deal was complete. This time completely. As the room cleared, my son lingered behind. They increased the price because of the delay, he said. It cost them leverage. It cost them assumption. I corrected gently. He gave a small, tired smile. I should have come to you first. Yes, I said simply. We stood there for a moment in the empty conference room. 42 years earlier, Richard and I had stood in that same space when it was nothing more than drywall and folding chairs. We believed control meant working hard enough to keep something alive. Now I understood something else. Control also means knowing when to slow things down. As we walked out together, I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. The company was sold. The numbers were larger. The future was different. But one thing had been made clear. I had not been erased. And from that day forward, no one in that room would ever mistake silence for surrender again. The wire transfer cleared the following Monday. 8 figures, distributed precisely according to the amended agreement. For the first time since Richard's funeral, the company account balances no longer defined our future. The house felt quieter that week. Not tense anymore. Just reflective. My son had moved into their new home over the weekend. The renovation brochures were replaced with moving boxes and framed photos. My daughter-in-law stopped by briefly to collect a few remaining things from the guest wing. She was polite, measured, careful with her words. Congratulations, she said softly. It worked out well. It worked out correctly, I replied. There's a difference. By Wednesday, I met with Daniel again. Not about the sale. About the next step. I want to restructure my holdings, I told him. Diversify, he asked. Protect, I said. We discussed irrevocable trusts, asset shields, long-term allocations. I wasn't reacting out of fear. I was building structure. Richard always believed wealth without structure invites confusion, and confusion invites conflict. That afternoon, my son came by alone. He stood in the kitchen where this had all begun. No raised voices. No legal folders. Just the two of us. I've been thinking, he said. I waited. I thought stepping in meant taking over. Making decisive moves. Proving I could lead. You can lead, I said calmly. He looked up. But leadership isn't removal, I continued. It's inclusion. He nodded slowly. I didn't mean to sideline. You. I know, I replied. And I did. Ambition isn't betrayal by default. But silence can feel like it. He leaned against the counter, the same way he used to after high school football practice. Tired. Honest. When Dad died, he said quietly, I felt like I had to prove something. To the board. To the employees. And to me? I asked gently. He hesitated. Yes. The air softened. You didn't need to replace him, I said. You needed to work with what he built. He let that sit for a moment. I should have asked, he said finally. Yes, I answered. Not with anger. Just with truth. Before he left, he paused at the doorway. Are you staying in the house? He asked. For now, I replied. He nodded. When the door closed behind him, I walked into my study and looked at the original shareholder binder one last time. It had served its purpose. Not to block a deal. Not to win an argument. But to remind everyone, including myself, that presence doesn't disappear with age. I wasn't just the founder's widow. I was still a decision maker. And now, everyone knew it. Not because I raised my voice, but because I never lowered my standards. A month after the sale closed, I went back to the old warehouse. Not because I had to, because I wanted to. The new owners had already replaced the signage. Different logo. Different trucks parked outside. The building looked the same from a distance, but it no longer carried our name across the front. I didn't feel anger. I felt history. I walked slowly along the side of the building, remembering the first winter we worked here. The heater broke twice. Richard and I wore gloves while reviewing inventory. We couldn't afford delays, so we learned to endure discomfort. That's how the company was built. Not quickly, not recklessly, carefully. Inside my purse was a small envelope. Not legal documents this time. Not contracts. A check. After the restructuring, I allocated a portion of my proceeds into a foundation in Richard's name. A scholarship fund for first-generation business students at the local community college. We started with nothing but discipline and belief. Someone else should get that chance too. Later that afternoon, I met my son for coffee. Neutral ground. A small cafe halfway between his new house and mine. He looked different. Not defeated. Just steadier. They finalized the integration, he said. Everything's settled. I know, I replied. We sat quietly for a moment. I've been reviewing leadership training programs, he added. Executive governance. Board dynamics. I nodded once. Good. He studied me. You could have stopped the whole thing, he said. If you wanted to. Yes, I answered honestly. But I didn't want to stop it. I wanted to be acknowledged. There's a difference. He understood that now. As we stood to leave, he hesitated. Thank you, he said. For what? For not humiliating me. I held his gaze. I was never trying to win against you, I said softly. I was protecting what your father and I built. And teaching you how to protect it too. Outside, the afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the sidewalk. That dinner night, when he smiled and said they had already sold the company, he thought the story was over. He thought the signature no longer mattered. But signatures aren't just ink. They represent presence, authority, history. I didn't shout. I didn't threaten. I didn't beg. I simply reminded everyone, including my own son, that I was still here. The company was sold. The money was transferred. Life moved forward. But something else had been secured in the process. Respect. And sometimes, that's worth more than any valuation. When I returned home, I walked past Richard's portrait in the hallway. I handled it, I said quietly. And for the first time since that dinner announcement, I smiled. Not because I won, but because I was never erased.